Chapter 4. Commencing of polling, 7 a.m. At 7 a.m., the presiding officer is required to declare the polling station open and allow a small number of voters standing in the voting queue to enter the polling station. Any election agents, local observers, police, and electoral officers registered to vote at the particular polling station that are not listed as postal voters must be given the opportunity to vote before the start of the normal polling process, which we will talk about shortly. Now, once these individuals have voted, the regular voters can now then start voting. Do not forget that soon after the polling station has opened, the presiding officer must inform the constituency election officer of the time his or her polling station has opened, the number of people in the queue,
whether the environment was peaceful,
and any other relevant details, no matter how small they are.
Chapter 4.1. Polling process and polling staff roles. The polling process is very important. Charlene, how does it go?
Well, it's pretty straightforward, but please do pay attention. Firstly, bear in mind that the voting process is similar to past elections. It comprises of 6 easy steps. Before joining the queue, it is recommended that each voter checks that his or her name appears on the voter's roll that is posted near the entrance of the polling station. This is to avoid frustration with individuals wasting time queuing at the wrong place.
Step 1.
Check the voter has an acceptable identification document and that there is no indelible ink on his or her fingers. Step number 2.
Confirm the voter is listed on the polling station voter's roll.
And step number 3. Re-inspect the voter's fingers to ensure that there are no signs of indelible ink. If there is none, mark the appropriate voter's finger with an indelible ink marking pen.
Step 4.
Give the voter 1 ballot paper for each election and show the voter how the ballot paper should be folded. Inform the voter that each ballot paper has a color that matches its respective ballot box's label. And please do explain that after each ballot paper has been marked by the voter, it must be folded prior to inserting it into its corresponding ballot box. Step number 5.
The voter enters the polling booth and marks his or her vote on each ballot paper. He or she then folds each ballot as instructed and exits the polling booth.
Step number 6. The voter places each ballot in its corresponding ballot box. In the case of harmonized elections, extra care must be taken to ensure that each ballot paper is inserted into its correct ballot box. The voting process is now complete. The voter may leave the polling station. Priority should be given to pregnant women, the frail, the elderly. They should be escorted to the front of the queue at all times. Voters who can't read and those who can't see may bring a person of their choice to help them. However, that person must be 18 years or older and have their own identification document. An assisting person, also known as a confidant, may only assist 1 voter.
4.2. Polling process and polling staff roles. Please kindly explain each step in greater detail.
Of course. Voters will queue up outside the polling station room. Before joining the queue, it is recommended that each voter checks that his or her name appears on the voter's roll that is posted near the entrance of the polling station. This is to avoid frustration with individuals wasting time queuing at the wrong places. A police officer will ensure that peace and order is maintained in the queue. Throughout the day, any pregnant women, the elderly, or infirm voters should be escorted to the front of the queue. Step number 1. An usher is positioned immediately at the door of the polling station room. The usher will check that each voter has a suitable form of identification, is of the right age, and has no visible signs of marking ink on his or her fingers. A Zimbabwean national identity document issued under the National Registration Act is one of the documents that are acceptable for voting. The second one is a green waiting pass, which has a photo of the holder. Also accepted is a valid Zimbabwean passport, one that has not expired. Photocopied documents will not be accepted even if they are certified. Also, please note that a Zimbabwean driver's license will not be accepted as a valid ID document for voting. Furthermore, a voter registration certificate will not be accepted as a valid document for voting. All documents that are badly damaged, appear to have been intentionally tampered with, or are not readable will not be accepted. The person must be asked to produce another acceptable form of identification. Only people on that polling station voters' roll presenting one of the above mentioned acceptable identification documents where we previously mentioned will be allowed to vote. People who attempt to vote on the sole basis of presenting a voter registration certificate must not be allowed to vote. In case any person does not have any of the acceptable forms of identification mentioned, please refer them to the presiding officer for further assessment. If the presiding officer decides to turn that person away, he or she will instruct the recording officer to record the person's details and the reason why they have been turned away. Ushers must not turn away any voters with identity documents endorsed NCR, which means non-citizen resident, or A, which means alien. They must proceed like any other voter to the voters' roll officer.
If they are not found on the voters' roll, the presiding officer must be called.
Once the usher is satisfied with the individual's identification and sees that his or her fingers have no marking ink, then that person can proceed to the voter's roll officer.
And step number 2, the voter's roll officer then inspects the voter's identity document to make sure that it matches the person presenting it to him. Once satisfied, the voter's roll officer will locate the name of the person on the voter's roll.
If the voter's record is not already crossed out and is not marked as PV, which means postal voting, then the voter's record is crossed out by a cross or an X over it.
The voter will then be asked to proceed to the ballot paper issuer. However, when a person's name has already been crossed out or marked PV, then the person must be declined from proceeding and be referred to the presiding officer. You are required to take extreme care when crossing out the voter's name, especially in the case where several voters may have the same first name and surname. Always remember to check the person's national ID number. A voter must not be denied if there are minor differences or slight errors between his or her names on the voter's roll and the identity document, provided that it's obvious it's the same person. For example, Madlango or Mudlango, or Madlingo. Then go on to compare the national identity number on the ID document and the voter's roll. If the ID numbers match, allow the voter to vote. Or when a married woman that states she was registered under her maiden name, the voter's roll officer must then check whether she exists on the voter's roll and compare her national identity number on the ID document to the one in the voter's roll. If these numbers match, allow the voter to vote. Before the voter is allowed to proceed, the voter's roll officer must mark the gender and age statistics form. To speed up the process, voter's sex or gender and age will be printed on the voter's roll. Step number 3, Tafadzwa.
Next, the indelible ink marking officer. He or she must first check to see if a voter has any visible signs of indelible ink markings on his or her fingers. If the voter has dirty, discolored or painted fingernails, the indelible ink marking officer must clean the voter's finger with acetone and cotton wool, inspecting it if there is no ink marking. Proceed to mark it.
The finger will be marked by drawing a line that spans from the fingernail to the cuticle, as shown here. However, in case the relevant finger or any other finger had previously been stained with indelible ink, the presiding officer must be called to confirm, and if he or she agrees, then the person must not be allowed to proceed.
What if a voter has missing fingers or limbs?
Well, in such a case, then the voter's leftmost finger should be marked. If the leftmost finger is the missing one, then the next leftmost finger must be marked. If there are no fingers on the left hand or the entire left hand is missing, then the rightmost finger on the right hand must be marked. Similarly, if the rightmost finger is missing, then the next rightmost finger is marked, and so on. If the voter has no hands, then the left or right limb will be marked. If the voter has no arms, then the leftmost toe will be marked, and so on. If the voter has no arms and no feet, then one of the stumps of the voter must be marked. Step number 4. The ballot paper issuer will then issue the voter with one ballot paper for each election.
In the case of harmonized elections, the voter will receive one presidential ballot paper, which is blue, one National Assembly ballot paper, which is peach, and one local authority ballot paper, which is yellow.
The ballot paper issuer will show the voter how the ballot paper should be folded. Inform the voter that each ballot paper has a color that matches its respective ballot box's label, and explain that after each ballot paper has been marked by the voter, it must be folded prior to inserting it into its corresponding ballot box. The ballot paper issuer must make sure that each ballot paper is free from noticeable defects and then proceed to stamp the back of the ballot paper with the polling station's secret mark. The ballot paper issuer may not record nor disclose which ballot paper was issued for which voter. This is a breach of the Declaration of Secrecy and is a punishable electoral offence. If a ballot paper is torn when separating it from its counterfoil, it must not be handed to a voter. Instead, it must be handed over to the presiding officer, who will treat it the same way as any other cancelled ballot paper. This process will be described shortly. Step number 5. The voter will then proceed to the polling booth. He or she will mark the ballot paper. Here are some examples of correct and incorrect ways to mark the ballot paper.
Examples of a valid vote, examples of an invalid vote.
Now let's find out what happens if a voter makes a mistake when marking his or her ballot. The voter must fold this particular ballot paper and return it to the presiding officer and ask for a replacement ballot paper. The voter must not place the ballot paper with the mistake in the ballot box. Under no circumstances will any mistake be entertained after the ballot paper has been placed in the ballot box. The presiding officer must keep the paper folded and is not allowed to see how the voter had mismarked the paper. The presiding officer must draw double lines across the spoiled ballot paper and write the word cancelled. The presiding officer must also write the word spoiled on the counterfoil of the cancelled ballot paper. The cancelled ballot paper must then be placed in an envelope marked cancelled ballot paper. A voter is not allowed to take a cancelled ballot paper home or to put it in a ballot box. The details of the voter must be recorded on Pro Forma PE 2005/3 before a new ballot paper is issued to the voter. Before leaving the polling booth, the voter must fold his or her ballot papers as shown by the ballot paper issuer.
Step 6. The voter should always place the correct ballot paper in the matching ballot box. Note that different colors are used for different elections. Again,
presidential, blue, National Assembly, peach, local authority, yellow.
The ballot paper and the ballot box labels have matching colors for each election. Now, once the voter has cast his or her vote, he or she must leave the polling station promptly.
the polling process is not stopped for a lunch break during polling.
Now, what is the role of the recording officer?
The recording officer records all issues related to polling as given by the presiding officer. These include
Record the details of all persons turned away and the reason why they were turned away, such as the person is not on the polling station voter's roll.
Person has no identity
The
documents.
person refused to have his or her finger marked with indelible ink.
The person has previously been marked on the voter's roll as having voted.
Record the details of assisted illiterate and blind voters on Proforma PE 2005/1. Note that the thumbprint of such voters must be placed on the form using a stamp pad.
For all assisted voters, the details of the assisting person, sometimes referred to as the confidant, must also be recorded.
The assisting person must be 18 years or older.
The assisting person may not be an electoral officer, an observer, chief election agent, an election agent, or a candidate.
And the assisting person must be asked whether he or she has assisted any other voters to vote.
If the person has already assisted someone to vote in these elections, then he or she must not be allowed. No person is permitted to assist more than one voter.
The record of persons assisting to vote, which is Form PE 2005/1A, must then be checked to ensure the confidant's name is not already on the list.
In the case of a visually impaired voter who has brought a confidant to assist him or her, the voter and his or her confidant will proceed to vote normally. However, the presiding officer is required to observe the marking of the ballot paper to make sure the visually impaired voter's wishes are respected. It should be explained to the visually impaired voter that he or she is allowed to turn away the presiding officer from observing if the voter fully trusts his or her assistant.
What documents must the assisting person present need to have, and does he or she have to be a registered voter?
No, Tafadzwa, the assisting person does not have to be a registered voter. The person may present any government-issued identification, a Zimbabwean passport or a Zimbabwean national identification document or a Zimbabwean driver's license that has his or her details as well as the photo.
What happens if a voter needs to be assisted but has not brought along a confidant to assist?
Then the presiding officer may assist such a voter. 2 additional electoral officers or employees of the commission and a police officer must observe to ensure that the voter's wishes are fully respected.
What is the role of the presiding officer actually?
The presiding officer is the key overseer and is in charge of a polling station. He or she manages the poll at the polling station as stated by the law and supervises all activities. As we've already said, the presiding officer is responsible for ensuring that all the necessary electoral materials and equipment is collected from the constituency elections officer and delivered to the polling station in good time and in good order. Soon after arriving at his or her assigned polling station, the presiding officer must conduct training rehearsals with his or her polling station staff so that everyone is familiar with the various roles and responsibilities at each position. The presiding officer is also responsible for ensuring the polling station is set up so that polling may start on the prescribed day and time without any delays. The police officers assigned to provide security at the polling station operate under the direction of the presiding officer. Section 55(3) of the Electoral Act gives presiding officer the power to arrest any person committing electoral offences such as impersonation, obstructing the electoral processes,
Preventing others from voting?
The presiding officer is answerable to the ward elections officer and the constituency elections officer.
Okay, can you now clarify the role of the police officer?
The police officers within a radius of 300 meters of the polling station must operate under the guidance and supervision of the presiding officer. The police officers are there to maintain peace and order in the polling station queues. When inside a polling station, the police officers will work under the direction and instruction of the presiding officer. When requested by the presiding officer, then they may perform any additional support required, such as escorting a disruptive person from the polling station or observe the ballot paper marking for an illiterate
Or visually impaired voter as stated by law.
The police officers shall not interfere with the electoral processes at a polling station. It is not allowed for anyone to be arrested solely for the purpose of preventing them from voting, and it's not allowed to intimidate any voters. Chapter 4.3, Polling Process, clarification on some key issues. Now, before we press on to the next section, it may be a good time right now to clarify a few key points regarding the polling process.
Yes, indeed. This is a good time. Let's clarify some points.
Chapter 4.3.1, voters will only be allowed to vote at their assigned polling station. Unlike past elections, voters will no longer be permitted to vote at any polling station within their ward. Instead, a voter must go to his or her assigned polling station. Let me explain why this is so. It is a very important point. Section 32 of the Electoral Act requires ZEC to take all reasonable steps to ensure that every eligible citizen has one and only one voter registration record. This is just one of several measures taken in democratic elections to ensure that each voter will be allowed to cast one and only one vote for any individual election. To ensure this principle is adhered to, the new voters' rolls are polling station specific and each voter will be assigned to their specified polling station. On polling day, the voter must go to his or her assigned polling station as that is the only voters' roll in the entire country on which his or her name will appear. If they go to any other polling station, they will not be allowed to vote as their name will not appear there. Now, Chapter 4.3.2. Voter registration certificates must not be accepted at polling stations. Now I'll go on to explain why a voter registration certificate must not be accepted at polling time. There may be instances where a person has a voter registration certificate in his or her possession. However, that individual's registration may have been rejected at ZEC head office after a more thorough computerized examination was concluded.
Please explain to our viewers how such a situation can arise.
We first need to understand a little bit about the BVR process. Do you recall that immediately after voter registration on a BVR kit, a person was given his or her voter registration certificate? So at that time, no additional verification checks were done but have now been done by the ZEC head office. A few days later, the biometric voter registration data from all the BVR kits is consolidated within the central voters database at ZEC head office. A series of more thorough computerized checks was now performed in order to ensure that a high-quality, clean voters roll is produced. For example, using biometrics, multiple voter registrations for the same individual will be detected and rejected, even if that individual registered on different kits or even in different provinces, it will be detected. Furthermore, ZEC central systems are also able to cross-reference an individual's data with other government departments. Thus, any fraudulent voter registrations using falsified identity documents will also be detected and rejected. Thus, as we can see, the individual may have a voter registration certificate in his or her possession. However, from the above explanation, it is clear that this does not necessarily mean the certificate matches a valid voter's record.
I trust this is now clear to all why a voter registration certificate must never be accepted on polling day for the purpose of permitting someone to vote.
Chapter 4.3.3. So what is the purpose of the voter registration certificate?
Can you explain to our viewers why the voter registration certificate was even issued to the individual in the first place?
Yes, certainly. The voter registration certificate is your proof that you are registered on a BVR kit and carries some basic information regarding your registration details. Inspection of the voter's roll takes place a few months before election day. During the inspection of the voter's roll, if you cannot find your name on the polling station that you registered for, then you need to approach a ZEC election official. The election official will inspect your voter registration certificate so as to confirm that you are at the correct polling station that you registered for and whether your name appears on the list of rejected voters of that location. If your application was rejected, then you will be given the reason why. In the rare event where your record cannot be located in neither the accepted nor the rejected voter applicants for that station, then ZEC will investigate to locate your BVR record. If your BVR record has somehow been irrevocably lost, then you will be requested to re-register on one of the BVR kits at one of the continuous BVR registration centers.
Thank you, Charlene. It's now clear that the voter registration certificate is only there to assist with inquiries during the voter's roll inspection time, and it is of no use during polling day.